Nearly 43,000 people died in traffic crashes last year, each of them a parent or child, colleague or friend. Transportation produces more carbon emissions than any other sector at a time when the nations of the world are rallying to confront the climate challenge. And as Americans grapple with the effects of inflation, we know that transportation is the second largest household expense after housing.
The United States is currently on the brink of a transportation revolution, the likes of which haven't been seen since the 19th century. Our current system of transportation is not working. If I were elected to Congress, the first issue I would tackle would be transportation. I would work to improve and increase mass public transportation nationwide. The Infrastructure Report Card, an organization that grades aspects of American infrastructure, gave public transit a D-. Even though over 80% of Americans live in urban areas, only 11% of adults use public transportation on a weekly basis. Only 51% of American households reported that they could get to a grocery store using public transportation. Improving public transit would have a myriad of benefits for the United States. It would make roads safer, reduce carbon emissions, and it would help communities reduce levels of poverty. Increasing public transit can reduce traffic-related injuries and deaths. Increased mass transit in the form of buses would reduce the amount of vehicles on the road, reducing the amount of traffic incidents. Increased forms of rapid transit would also help this issue by simply taking people off of the roads.
Bus rapid transit is basically just a lane on a road that's dedicated just for a bus. In order for buses to be as fast as possible, they have their own lane, but also there are these kind of little stops that they look a lot like subway stops that just elevate up like a foot with a ramp so that when you get on the bus, one, it's more handicap accessible if you're using a wheelchair, but then also the bus doesn't have to go down and the bus is able to do these fast loops because they don't have to stop for 30 seconds just to deflate the air to let people on, and it's more accessible for people that have different abilities.
In addition, it is much safer to travel in buses on the roads, as a large bus fares better in traffic accidents than a car. Bus drivers also have more training than the average driver, making it safer to drive with them. Public transportation also helps to reduce carbon emissions. Almost 12% of carbon emissions come from road transport, and by reducing the amount of vehicles transporting Americans, we would reduce the amount of emissions from individual transit. Increased public transportation can also be key to reducing urban poverty. Growing up just outside of Detroit, I've seen firsthand how not having access to transportation can affect communities. In the 2020 census, 31.8% of Detroiters were living in poverty, compared to the national average of 11.6%. This is in part because of the failings of the public transportation system in Detroit. The current system of transportation is very underfunded.
They don't have basic transportation now in a public transit system that's reliable, that is on time, that they can use on a regular basis. So within the city, you can catch buses. I mean, there is an existing transportation system. It's just not at all reliable.
Without access to public transportation, people without a car cannot do things like get to work, get to schools, go to the grocery store, get to court, or get to job interviews. Because Michigan has one of the highest car insurance rates in the country, and Detroit's car insurance rates are even higher, it is very challenging to own a car in Detroit.
Essentially, if you live in the city of Detroit, they kind of give you higher rates because your car is more likely to get broken into, it's more likely to get hit by another car. There's vandalism, there's theft, and that drives up the insurance rates.
All of these things perpetuate the cycle of poverty. With increased funding to public transportation, forms of public transit would be more reliable, helping citizens without cars get to where they need to go and maintain a stable income. With all of these benefits, it's hard to understand why public transportation has been neglected by the federal government for so long.
How much is currently being spent on our infrastructure, on our transportation infrastructure, without adding any more money to it?
Well, I think the important point here is not enough. The funding from the federal government for infrastructure has remained pretty consistent for the last 15 or 20 years.
One of the most common arguments against public transit is the cost. Funding for public transit mostly comes from taxpayers, so increasing funding would mean increasing taxes.
A $3.5 or more trillion tax and spend plan.
Many people also argue that the people who already have access to the system are not using it. However, this is often a product of the poor quality of the systems, another result of the minimal funding. A final reason is one of America's most enduring issues.
It's racism. We don't want the other.
Really, I think 60% of African American women in the city don't have cars.
Public transportation is vital to decreasing road deaths, decreasing carbon emissions, and helping to improve economic well-being of citizens. As we enter a new age of transportation technology, public transportation remains a central issue and one that must be addressed by Congress.